Hello and welcome to the study of the Kingdom of Auschwitz. This is not an easy topic to talk about, but we're going to look at schools, how they can become transmitters of ideology, and about the hidden curriculum. You've probably heard that term before. Anyway, I want to start first of all by asking a couple of questions. How is it possible? What kind of people would kill millions of their fellow human beings? And what have we learned from the millions who have suffered and died between 1940 and 1945? The early beginnings of this movement saw them establish camps for undesirable people, Polish army officers, dissidents, heretics. Himmler saw them as a labor force for agricultural research, symphony orchestras, or as workers in armament factories, shoe factories, and in a synthetic rubber factory. All kind of productive work for their prisoners. The killings, how did they begin? They didn't start with mass murders, but they started with the killings of 50,000 of their mentally ill patients, Germans, their own people, and by carbon monoxide poisoning, if you remember in the readings. Well, let's look at the kingdom of Auschwitz here. As the trains would come to the station, they would see the sign "Arbeit macht frei," work makes you free. Man, beautiful settings all around. Whitewashed farmhouses surrounded by fruit trees and shrubs, and the people, everything was in order. People thought they were going to be well taken care of. This is well organized. Little did they know what was about to happen to them, and many of them, it was about to be the end of their lives. The separation process, taken in brightly lit rooms. The process was orderly and efficient. 9,000 in a 24-hour period. There were so many that they were processing through and murdering that they had to dig large pits to burn the remaining. The others that survived were destined to become workers or prostitutes, and most of them could only expect to live up to 3 months. Rituals were designed to destroy their identities and personalities. Clothes, hair, uniforms, according to categories. Tattoos were on their left forearms. They were known only by their numbers. When I visited one of the concentration camps at Buchenwald, the owners, or the commandant there, his wife, had a hobby of making lampshades and gloves, and she would inform the guards, when you see some interesting tattoos, bring them to me. And she would have those persons' tattoos taken off of them, murdered, and then brought to her, and she wove this. I was mortified when I first saw these, and I was wondering, how could people do these kinds of things? Well, let's take a look at Hess. Here was a man who once wrote, "I was taught that my highest duty was help those in need." How could someone like that commit such atrocities? He once said that it was constantly impressed on me in forceful terms that I obey promptly the wishes and commands of my parents, teachers, and priests. His parents determined that he would become a priest. His great love for the soil led him to become a farmer and the father of 5 children. He was a man that was emotionally disturbed when he witnessed his first flogging at Dachau. He later spoke that we're all emotionally tormented by secret doubts, but I dared not to admit to such doubts. Does Hess represent the ultimate evil of the German nation, their rationality or ultimate irrationality? Or did he and others like him merely respond to the political issues in which they found themselves? Hess was no more a born killer than you or I are born killers. So what is it in our humanness that allows us to become Hesses on the one hand, or dedicated missionaries willing to sacrifice one's own life to alleviate the suffering of others. Did not Hess appear to have those propensities to become a missionary? Even though he committed great evil, he had the potential for radical good. So how could Hess violate his own conscience with actions subordinate to his own understanding of a situation to that of some other authority? Who were these people carrying out these atrocities? Such atrocities were not committed by a few thugs or misfits. The ideas were conceived by some of the elite and highly educated people in Germany. These were no small ideas conceived in dark closets. The Germans boasted the most highly educated army that ever existed. Individuals issued orders and were operating within their legitimate domain of authorities. Their orders came from Hitler. The Jews must be eradicated. Hess didn't even question the orders. The orders were not clear and often contradictory. Have them killed or used for labor? How could such blind obedience have come about? How did so many ordinary people acquiesce to what they knew to be happening? These atrocities could not have been committed without the obedience of tens of hundreds of thousands and the acquiescence of many more. People saw the smoke, smelled the stench, tasted the polluted waters, drove the trains. The stories filtered out. They all knew what was happening. What is horrifying about them is what they did and not who they were. They were just ordinary people. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. One lesson we can learn from this is that under some social systems, the condition for compliance or tacit acceptance are so powerful that an outsider might well pause to wonder whether there, but for the grace of God, go I. What if I was driving the trains or flying those airplanes? What if you were a woman guard at there and you saw what was happening? Would you stand up? We're going to look at some of the things that have to happen before people can do these terrible atrocities to people. A common and necessary practice in times of war and mass atrocity is the dehumanization of the victim. To do these atrocities, the German had to go through a process of dehumanizing the victim. This is the counterpart of the obedient person's self-picture of himself as an agent of another's will, someone who has a job to do and who does it whether he likes it or not. The obedient person sees himself as an instrument. By the same token, he sees the victim as an object. People are led to believe that the victims deserve their punishment. Victims are rarely described as people, but only as bodies, objects, and numbers. Commandant Joseph Kramer described his prisoners as habitual criminals, felons, and homosexuals. It was their goal to cleanse humanity by ridding it of the vermin. In a related kind of self-justification, the fault is projected on the victims, and they are considered to be subhuman, dirty, evil, and only have themselves to blame. A British forced a group of German civilians to march through a nearby Nazi camp. In the days after the war, one of the civilians was overheard to remark, "What terrible criminals these prisoners must have been to get such punishment." And if you looked at the video, you saw some of the burgomeisters as they had to observe and see what was happening with their own eyes. Another thing that we use and we use it even today, is called the language of accommodation. These are phrases that we use to keep all thoughts of blood and suffering at a safe distance. They use the word final solution. Do you remember what that was? Final solution. That was the mass murder of 6 million persons and special treatment. That was death by gassing. Today we have similar terms. We have, back in the 1960s, when I was a teenager, they had something called the fallout problem. That was here in the US, fallout problem. And this is, we were fearful of death by radiation because that was something that during the Cold War that we were all afraid of. And we built a lot of bomb shelters as a result. In the war on Iraq and even Afghanistan, we did something called a preemptive attack, or softening the target. Do you remember what that was? That was bombing them day and night for several days, and we call it softening the target. That's killing as many people and destroying as much as we can. During the Vietnam War, we used to have a term every night on the news. It was called the body count. And this was the number of Viet Cong killed and our troops that were killed. And they did this every night. You notice that in current times, they don't do that because that was too close to suffering and pain. And we just don't do that anymore. But that was a body count. We have a nuclear missile called the Peacekeeper. Yeah, a nuclear warhead called the Peacekeeper. We have terms today called ethnic cleansing. What is that? That's extermination of people. Ethnic cleansing. And it's extermination just based on their race or religion or something that it's called a cleansing. All these dry official phrases are admirably suited to keep all thoughts of blood and human suffering at a reasonably and safe distance from us. For the Germans, the initial act of obedience was relatively mild and did not seriously clash with their own moral outlook. Just killing some of the mentally ill. Escalation was gradual so that each step seemed only slightly different from the one before. So here's a lesson that we can learn. First, they committed these crimes out of duty. They were ordered to do it, they did it. Then they did it out of habit. They didn't require orders. They just knew what they were to do. And finally, what I call radical evil. They did it for pleasure. They actually found pleasure in killing these people. So I ask this question. Is it possible that Auschwitz is merely a microcosm of our world today, and that our schools are contributing to teaching traits that are similar to those in Germany during World War II? I want you to think about this a minute. Stanley Milgram in 1963 did a study. He was very concerned about this and wanted to see if there were some similarities of what we're doing in our education with that of the Germans, because obedience was huge. That was more important than getting the right answer. It was following the directions, doing it. So in 1963, they did a study, the Milgram study, and I hope that you've had time to look at it. And he set up this box with voltage, went from 120 volts to 350 volts. And the lever, every 30 degrees, there was a lever. So they went from slight shock to great shock. Then they brought in two people. One was, they cast lots, and one was the teacher and one was the learner. The teacher was actually the one that we were going to focus on. The learner was an actor, and he was to give predetermined answers. And so the teacher was told that this is a lesson on memory and a study of memory and punishment as it relates to memory. So he was, every time the student got a wrong answer, they would increase the shock. Now, psychologists said nobody's going to do that. That's too painful. 450 volts, 350 volts, you can kill somebody with that. Actually, it went up to 450 volts. And so they started the experiment, and you could see some examples. You can actually go online, and they do similar experiments today with a little bit different results, and we can talk about that later. What they found out is that 65% of the people obeyed the professor when he said, continue shocking all the way to 450 volts. 65%. These are well-educated people, normal. They made sure that they filtered out anybody that was not normal, whatever that means. When they increased the distance so that it was a long way away, still 30% did it. When they got, 90% did it that way. When they got real close where they could actually apply the pressure, direct pressure, 30% still went to 450 volts. So what is it that we're doing or not doing that might foster such extreme behaviors out of normal people? How do we stress obedience and respect for authority in our schools today? How is it taught? To many parents, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues that children should learn. What kind of understanding about obedience does our teaching lend itself? Do we teach our kids to question things, or do we expect blind obedience? How do we teach obedience as it relates to moral judgment? Do we teach that at all? That there's a time to disobey? Do we even teach what Martin Luther King said about unjust laws and what we're supposed to do? How do we teach respect for authority and at the same time teach our children to resist authority when it becomes morally wrong? It is vital that we are aware of the dangers which are inherent in the hidden curriculum, which expects blind obedience at all costs. And I hope that as you go through this lesson, I know it's kind of a heavy lesson for you to go through, but I promise you, when we do the I and thou next time, it's going to be radical love. So we're going from radical evil to radical love, and I hope to hear and look at some of your comments. Thank you.